Have you ever been scrolling Pinterest and you see something so perfect that you have to have it in your house? And then you check the price? Instant heartbreak. But also, challenge accepted. I've set out to create one of these beautiful Pojagi curtains I've seen all over Pinterest. I'll be teaching you the modern version of this sewing technique, and I will be showing you how I created my pattern and how I pieced it all together. Be sure to like and subscribe, and let's jump right in. First, grab 2 pieces of fabric that share either the same length or the same width. Pin or clip your pieces together. We are going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. With this technique, your final flat felt seam will be half of your original seam allowance, so our final seam will be 1/4 inch. Next, open up your 2 pieces of fabric with the seam allowance facing up. Choose the panel that you would like your flat felled seam to be on, and snip off the allowance on that side. Be careful not to cut your stitches, but get as close as you can. Next, we're going to fold over the larger seam allowance. Fold it in half once towards your stitches, and then once more over your cut seam allowance until it lays flat. This will enclose your cut seam allowance as well as the edge of your longer seam allowance. We will press and pin this flat and then sew as close as we can to that folded seam edge. The really cool thing about this technique is that the seams are enclosed without a serger or a zigzag stitch, and that it's completely reversible. I'd love to see how I could incorporate this patchwork style in like a skirt or a dress. You can also play around with the size of that original seam allowance. For example, the bottom seam allowance here is 1 inch, the middle is 3/4 inch, and the top is a 1/2 inch. I went with the 1/2 inch seam allowance for my final piece, which meant that my flat felled seam was 1/4 inch. But depending on the look that you're going for, you could test out these sizes and see what's right for you. So now that we know the technique, let's plan our pattern. I have the perfect spot for this. I have kind of a breakfast nook style window in my kitchen that is in need of some color. First, I took some measurements to decide how large to make my piece. I wanted the outside edge to kind of frame it, so I made it a few inches smaller than my window. There's also a bar in the center and no light is going to shine through there, so I added my first lines here, breaking up the piece into a top and a bottom. I then began planning my seams throughout. It's super important that you connect new seams with existing seams. And then once I had these big shapes mapped out, I broke them down into smaller shapes and then I filled them in with color. Once I had my plan in place, I could start dyeing my fabric. I really wanted a terracotta color, a sagey green, and then a gold. So I ran to the craft store and I picked up a few colors that I thought might get me there. I started with the terracotta color by mixing the scarlet, the marigold, and then the brown. I tested out the color on a small swatch of fabric and would add a few more drops here and there until I created that final shade I was looking for. I did the same for the green, mixing the marigold, the dark green, the truly green, and then a tiny touch of the brown. And lastly, I did the gold, which was a super easy mix of the marigold and then a little bit of brown. After my swatches had dried, I stuck them to the window with the sun pouring through to see what those final colors would look like. And after seeing it like this, I ended up tweaking that green color as I didn't really like how it was looking. So this is a super important step so you're not disappointed in that final color when it has the light behind it. Once I was happy with my dye baths, I stuck my pieces of fabric in each, which I calculated using my pattern. Yes, I forgot to wet my fabric before placing it in the dye bath. Learn from my mistakes. I'm sure I would have had a cleaner final dye if I would have done this. I made sure to continue to agitate the jars throughout the dyeing process. The mason jars are awesome for this because they aren't messy at all, but don't use too much fabric in your jars as it can create splotchiness. I only let the gold develop for about 15 minutes as I was worried it was getting a little too brown, so I dumped it out and rinsed it thoroughly until the water ran clear. I let the green and the terracotta sit for a half hour, and then I did the same with those. Lastly, I hung these outside to dry and admired their beautiful colors. So once my fabric was dried, I started cutting my pieces to match my pattern. I labeled them on my pattern so I knew which pieces were which, and then I pinned on those numbers. After I cut out all my pieces, I could really see the design coming together. So now I had to plan out how I was going to assemble my puzzle. The trick here is to always sew pieces together that share a seam length. Some pieces need to be sewn together first before they can share that seam length with the piece next to it. So by starting at the top, you'll see I have to sew this yellow square to this white panel, and then I can sew both those pieces to the big green square. And then before I can connect this panel to the ones next to it, I have to sew those two pieces together. It takes a little bit of planning, but once you get the hang of it, your puzzle comes together quite quickly. And so all that was left was to just lock in and get sewing. All that was left at the end was to create a rolled hem around all of the edges, and then I added 4 strips to the top of the piece to attach it to my window. And here is the final piece. Overall, I am in love with how it turned out. The colors are perfect in my kitchen, and when the sun shines through, it gives the whole room a colored hue. If I were to do it again, I would choose a fabric that was maybe even more sheer so that more light would shine through, and I would also add a pocket at the top to hang it by a curtain rod. But overall, it was a fairly easy and quick project that has totally changed the look of my kitchen. I even like how it looks at night with the lights turned on. It kind of reminds me of a church lit up at night with stained glass windows. I hope I've inspired you to try this project out yourself, and please leave a comment if you do. Thanks for watching!